Hello and welcome to Money 2020 Hindsight, the cheat sheet for the least you need to know in fintech today. I'm Nick Holland, Global Head of Insights and Networks at Money 2020. Today we're going to discuss where's Do Kwon, King Charles's currency, and the money shot. Pew, pew. But first, as we always do on Money 20 Hindsight, Mickey, over to you for the number of the day.
Today is $1.4 billion.
What is it?
And so that's the total sum FTX is going to be paying to take over the assets of Voyager, the distressed crypto lender. And that's reported by CNBC.
SBK wins, right?
Wins SBF, right? SBF.
Oh, it's SBF, yes. That's
right. SBF, everything is in full motion, isn't it? So there were several rounds of bidding, according to CNBC, and in the end, that 1.4 billion was enough to sway Voyager to take the deal, and it includes $111 million, which have been earmarked for additional consideration in anticipation of incremental value. I guess that's talking about potential increases in their asset prices since the deal was transacted.
It's like for FTX, like the crypto winter never happened. I mean, it's just they seem to have been somehow completely safe with this. Kind of incredible.
Yeah, it is really fascinating. I guess they've managed to find a pretty good way of avoiding all of that, potentially by avoiding what Voyager did, which was fail to diversify and lend out something like $670 million to Three Arrows Capital, if you remember. And following the Luna collapse, Three Arrows collapsed, Voyager then collapsed, Celsius. So it was a domino effect.
So I guess there's some, I guess, evidence that maybe just keep into that North Star of stick with crypto and don't mess around with diversification.
Yeah, I mean, and yeah, I think that's a fair point.
Yeah. All right, so we're on to, I guess, second part of crypto news, which is like where's Waldo, but with Do Kwon. So CEO Terraform Labs is a wanted man. He's got not only South Korean prosecutors after him, but Interpol. So they put out a red notice to him. Tell me a bit more about that, Mickey.
Yeah, so, the first story we talked about, I guess Do Kwon is the kind of starting point, right? A few months ago, we saw that his algorithmic stablecoin, there was a run on it essentially, and overnight, near enough overnight, $40 billion were wiped out of the market, which kind of produced this contagion across the crypto market and saw the collapse of many of these other players, Celsius, Voyager, Three Arrows, and so forth. What I found really fascinating and fabulous, as I wrote in my notes, so you might have seen.
He's in hiding.
Yeah, so he's been texting, he's been tweeting from his living room saying he's coding, he's not hiding. So
Interpol, clearly you could just, I don't know, apparently he's going to walks on the mall, going to malls and things. So, wanted.
Talk about baiting the authorities. I wonder if this has something to do with the kind of rules around or the partnership Interpol might have with Singapore, because I think he's based in Singapore, so perhaps they're not willing to extradite. Yeah. So that's a safe haven for him, but that's just conjecture on my part, by the way. No offense, Singapore.
So let's move on to the next piece, which is obviously related to the very sad news of Queen Elizabeth II's passing, and I guess the handover to her son, who is now King Charles III. Clearly, there's a lot of banknotes out there with her face on it, postage stamps, so on and so forth. So those need to be replaced in some state in the not too distant future, I guess. So tell me about this a little bit.
Yeah, so firstly, it's quite a funny situation. I don't know how it is in the US, but in the UK, the banknotes are produced by the central bank, the Bank of England, and the coins are produced by the Royal Mint. But they both come out in the last couple of days pointing out that they will be starting the process of adding King Charles onto a new legal tender in the UK. The Royal Mint has said that while they'll be adding King Charles, it doesn't mean they're going to do a wholesale swap over that and remove all of the coinage that has Queen Elizabeth II on it. So there is going to be a period where there will be coins with two different monarchs in co-circulation, which, according to the Roman, I'm not a currency historian, but they said this is actually a historical precedent that's happened in the past as well.
I think that's an interesting segue into the discussion that I had, which will be the money shot part of our show today. I spoke with Dan Van Dyke of Insider Intelligence about the recent CFPB report on BNPL, and in particular, I think whether money is, or particularly lending, is becoming a little bit too frictionless, and again, the case for paper money making a comeback. So over to the money shot.
I have a special guest today. We have Daniel Van Dyke, who is the Vice President of Content and Head of Financial Services Verticals at Insider Intelligence. Dan, say hi.
And your former colleague. Hey, Nick.
And my former colleague as well. Absolutely. So we go back a ways. Anyway, we connected on LinkedIn the other day. There's some really interesting conversations Dan's been posting around BNPL and its existential crisis that's happening at the moment. I want to point to even a couple of things that are going on. Sort of on one side, you've got this huge threat of loan defaults. You've got, according to Insider Intelligence, and Dan, you probably put this together, 3 in 10 adults use buy now, pay later. If you break out that proportion, though, to Gen Z, it goes up to 46%. So there's probably a lot of thin file, no file customers in there, which is obviously dangerous in terms of delinquencies. And in fact, Bankrate study said that 42% of BNPL consumers have made a late payment so far. On the other side, and I think we saw this last week with the CFPB's recent report, spelling out the days that maybe making hay is coming to an end. So the regulatory thumb screws are tightening, certainly in the US, and I think probably in a lot of other countries as well. So, I mean, there was the 3 things that CFPB pointed out, which were concerns around discrete consumer harms, data harvesting, so the fact that the data from BNPL has begun to be used for other purposes, and then overextension, also known as loan stacking, where people are just obviously taking out far too much BNPL because it's too easy. There's some recommendations around that in terms of clearer disclosures and so on and so forth. But it seemed that again, like I say, the sheen is coming off BNPL. Apple announced an iOS update last week, conspicuously lacking in anything BNPL related. So, Dan, I guess the big question for you is this honeymoon over for BNPL?
Yeah, I would say so. You said the sheen is coming off. I think the mask is coming off, and underneath is Charlie Sheen. And I would say that a lot of monoline.
So the sheen is coming on, in fact. So that's worse, probably.
That's right. There's a lot of tiger blood pumping up the space. So yeah, I would say that the honeymoon is over. In a word, in 6 words, I would say it depends on who you ask. In that, from the perspective of consumers, I believe that buy now, pay later is here to stay. There are other providers who are going to fill the gap. From the perspective of providers, particularly monoline providers like Klarna or Afterpay, the future is definitely in question. From the perspective of investors, it's not a space that they want to touch with a 10-foot pole at the moment, unless they can get in at a really tasty valuation. And then from the perspective of regulators, which you alluded to in your preamble, they're definitely beginning to crack down in huge ways. And so around the next corner, I think the CFPB has signaled they're looking to regulate the space similarly to credit cards. You mentioned the 3 key sort of attack vectors that they're focusing on. So things like data harvesting, loan stacking are all coming under the microscope. For monoline buy now, pay later providers, there is a short clock that's begun ticking for them to pivot to new, more profitable business models before their burn rates run out and before regulators crack down on them in some pretty major ways. So let me pause there because I know I've thrown a lot at you. Does that sort of gel with what you're seeing in the space?
I think so, very much. I mean, I think, again, there was obviously, I think, a little bit of over-enthusiasm in investment generally last year. So looking at actually some of your reports, but also, some of the other things that are out there, some pitch book and so on and so forth. There's a huge reset going on in terms of all industries, I think. But, certainly we're seeing it in fintech. But if you've got someone like Klarna, where their valuations dropped 86%, I mean, it's still a unicorn, but it's much less of a unicorn. It's had its horn trimmed quite a bit, I think. So I think they really are exhibit A in terms of that sort of overall reset. But I think you're right. I mean, it's certainly the sort of heady days of BNPL are, I think, coming to a swift close. It's also, I mean, I think this goes into the next point, which is I think consumers, my hunch would be that consumers are starting to get a little bit more concerned about their finances. Yeah, I posted the other week, I did a blog around sort of, is money too frictionless? My hunch is that it is, and I think there's been some indicators in other places. I think that the post office in the UK, of all places, put out a report saying that, you know, that they're seeing a lot more use of cash. Well, duh, because the pandemic's over, according to Mr. Biden. But it's, I think, you know, one of their other hypotheses was that it was to do with people wanting to do sort of old school budgetary, sticking cash in envelopes for taking care of your monthly or weekly shopping. And I think there's some truth in that. I think, you know, BNPL is, I think, the sort of epitome of, you know, opaque payments. And, you know, if it gets to a point, as we've seen in some areas, and I think CFPB report focused on this, which is the way that BNPL is also diversified into not just sort of, you know, clothing and luxury goods and electronics, into everyday purchases. So if you're doing your grocery shopping and wanting, you know, 4 installment payments, that seems, again, a little bit too far.
I would agree. And so you asked the question, is buy now, pay later too frictionless? Yeah, I would say in a word again, yes. But to unpack that little, and first to circle back to an earlier point that you made around sort of the areas that the CFPB is focusing on. One of the understated areas that they called out in their report is dark patterns. And the way that buy now, pay later services are optimized is increasingly to drive revenue. And in the past, that was coming from areas like, you know, just the margin between what they are charging merchants versus what they are able to shave off by limiting, you know, delinquencies and anything else that they could do to clamp down on costs. Now they are pivoting with interest rates rising and their margins coming under pressure to new revenue streams, like, you know, pushing consumers to a merchant. So that's a big revenue driver for Klarna, for instance. It's sort of becoming like a super app. The risk here from the consumer perspective is, one, it's too easy to rack up a lot of loans. 2, you know, they might be pushed to different merchants too. So the kind of, you know, liability in a sense is shared between not just the buy now, pay later provider, but the merchants they're extending, you know, consumers to. And what this means from the macro perspective is this is a major factor behind rising delinquencies and rising charge-off rates that are affecting consumers and affecting businesses. And so just to bring it down to the human level for just a moment, you know, my wife is a therapist. She works in Brooklyn, and you know, she's hearing about a lot of people that she's working with making purchases that just frankly they can't afford. And so this is a big powder keg. In particular, that stat that you mentioned, with 46% of Gen Z having adopted buy now, pay later, there's a mountain of bad debt that is propping up this space. But I am bullish about the long-term prospects of it. I believe that the regulation is long overdue, and that it will set us up for a long period of sustained growth as buy now, pay later eats into their massive total addressable market, which is the $3 trillion that consumers spend online and offline on credit cards.
It's funny. I mean, I think, I don't know about you, but myself during the pandemic, there were a lot of impulse purchases I made just because I know, including a car, for example.
Oh wow, that's a big one.
That was not BNPL, but you know, but you can see
pay in 4 years.
That'd be nice. I was thinking an interesting area might be like, again, you know, organ transplants or something, BNPL for a kidney or something.
You get the first quarter of the kidney with your first payment.
Well, I think that the repo bit would be awful as well. But anyway. But it is almost a sort of, there is an addiction component to it in terms of, you know, I could have, it's the same as credit card debt. It's people overextending themselves because it's been made available. But it's, I mean, that industry is overall, I mean, that has had fairly tight scrutiny around it for quite some time. And you know, BNPL is that with the brakes off, you know, so it's, So I think you're right. I think it will be normalized, but it's certainly there's a reset in the works. Dan, always a massive pleasure. Just want to point out as well, your posts on this on LinkedIn are fascinating. You've recently launched a podcast, so folks, please go to Insider Intelligence. It's on all your usual platforms, Spotify, Apple Music, all the kind of usual places. So I checked it out. Dan and I will obviously also be at Las Vegas's Money 2020 next month, which
100%,
is very soon. So always a pleasure, sir. Let's obviously catch up in person fairly soon. But Dan Van Dyke from Insider Intelligence, and I'm Nick Holland, obviously, with Money 2020.
Well, thank you so much, Mickey, as ever, for being my wingman on the show. Thank you to Dan Van Dyke from Insider Intelligence for his insights on BNPL. Obviously, we're getting very close to our Money 2020 show in Las Vegas. So if you haven't bought tickets and accommodation, I would suggest you do so imminently. But we'd love to see you there. If you're going to be on the ground, let us know. I will be hanging out at the Money podcast booth. But certainly, before then, there'll be more insights on Money 20 Hindsight, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you.